Welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue with the theme of identity this morning, and I'd like to introduce Dmitry from Avast, who will talk about self-sovereign identity.
Hello, everyone. Hopefully, you guys can hear me well. Let me just see if I can figure out how it works. Excellent. Obviously, the topic of self-sovereign identity is interesting. It has been around for a few years, and it's getting into the market quite well and quite fast right now. It's obviously an emerging approach still that allows users or citizens to be in the center of all transactions and actually control the identity attributes. It's interesting that it's actually following the FIDO path, right? And we found it very entertaining because FIDO a long time ago started to be talked about at IW, right? And then it went as this foundation, right? And then it went through the W3C standardization efforts. And that's exactly what is happening to various SSI initiatives as well. There are two main standards in self-sovereign identity, if you follow them, but associated with DIDs and associated with verifiable credentials. But then there are a number of other supporting standards that are actually being developed in standardization organizations and community organizations as well. SSI, if any of you are not familiar with that, right, it allows you basically to mimic a very natural path of how we approach identity right now, right? We have certain credentials in our wallets, for example. We share them in a physical world. SSI, the concept of the SSI is to allow various issuers to issue these credentials to citizens. Citizens having access and control of those credentials in the wallet, and various organizations who receive these credentials will be able to verify them. We call them verifiers in the SSI world. The interesting point, of course, is that it not only puts the user in the center of the control of that identity, but it also eliminates a very peculiar call home problem for various verifiers, right? Where verifiers now can verify this identity without actually going to the issuer, which helps in many, many, many interesting use cases. The adoption of the SSI is growing. For people who are associated with it are actually, we always want more adoption and faster adoption, right? But some initiatives that have started did not go as fast as possible, but mind you, they were probably at the POC levels. Some of the initiatives that have started going slower than we want, but more and more companies and organizations actually start paying attention to the SSI world, right? So, and it's happening on both public side and on the private side as well, right? And we can, among the important ones, right, we have the very interesting public initiatives in the European Union. We have the DHS SVAP program in the United States that has been basically leading a lot of the self-sovereign identity in the US government, on the US government side. We have EIDAS wallet initiative, which is, once again, has been talked actually about even here. And then, of course, in the in the private industry, there are a number of the implementations about which I will talk about. So, a few of the examples of what self-sovereign identity looks like, right, in the real production. So that's IATA Travel Pass, right? It has been implemented and is running as an IATA initiative, right? Basically allows user to have certain credentials in their wallet and share them in user-controlled manner and way. this one included basically a passport and COVID certificate. Several airlines have been using that, right? And we will see how successful IATA will be rolling it out. But the point is that the initiatives worked and worked quite well. Another example is something that Department of Homeland Security has been working on, right, where the user basically is issued, for example, a permanent resident card for the United States permanent resident, and where they can use that card in various user flows for, once again, either conversing with a private company or a public company. The interesting part of the credentials, of the verifiable credentials in the SSI world, is that it allows user to share several credentials in one flow, right? That's one important point. Another important point, it allows user to basically have rely on the method of selective disclosure, right? Where you can say that I want to share some data about myself and not share other pieces of data about myself. What is interesting in this example, in the previous example, that we always refer to the user or citizen, but we also always show that user or citizen has to authenticate to their wallet, right? Because obviously to get to the wallet is very, very important. And in the typical SSI flow, this authentication is used several times. If I were to look at the typical SSI flow, we have an issuer who issues the credential to the holder or the user. We have obviously user having access to that wallet. We have user or holder sharing the credentials with the verifier, and then verifier verifying the credential. It's done through the method associated with DIDs and verifiable data registry. And that's actually where the authentication scenarios become very, very important, and where we start seeing synergies between SSI and FIDO. So where does authentication happen in self-sovereign identity world, right? So first of all, if I need to have my credentials to be issued, right, I typically need to authenticate to the credential issuer, right? That could be a government agency or a private organization, could be a bank, could be even the organization that has issued an education credential to me. Then, as a user, I know that I need to authenticate to my wallet. And that's typically the user experience, typical user experience, where the user has a mobile application. I need to authenticate to that mobile app to share something, right? Or to consent for the sharing, or maybe even to view my data. The interesting thing in the SSI world, right? Like it kind of like the concept of the wallet in the mobile application is easy to understand. But in many situations, we are seeing the requirement and the need in the SSI world where the wallet in the browser should be accessible to the user as well. And obviously that is associated with accessibility scenarios and with many use cases where the user actually might want to have data available to him for review in the browser or in the web flow. And then, of course, that drives the need for the combo wallets as well, right? Where the user might have several wallets. Some of them are in their mobile applications, and some of them are associated with their browser instances. So authentication is needed there. The level of authentication needs to be universal and on both authentication level and identity assurance as well. And then, of course, there is an authentication to the reliant party is very, very important. Basically, to ensure that we can link the account to the identity proofing event, right? For example, the use cases are very simple as I proven my identity to the bank to open a bank account. How do I keep authenticating to that bank, right? And maybe bank actually not the best scenario, but I've proven my identity to a retailer so that my stuff can be shipped later. How do I authenticate to that retailer going forward? How do I establish that authentication credential? Obviously, authentication is very important for the identity recovery flows, right? And then there is something else, which is actually very SSI specific, but has parallels to and probably very big interesting synergy in the FIDO world called DID authentication, right? So I will talk about DID authentication in a second. It's not really consumer-centric, but very essential. So what is DID authentication? We, in all our transactions with FIDO and, sorry, with SSI, we are using DIDs, or distributed identifiers. Obviously, when we use distributed identifiers, we want to ensure that the individual or the entity that has issued that particular distributed identifier has a control of the DID, right? So DID authentication allows us to do basically that. The interesting thing is, right, that for those of you who might not know, DIDs resolves to the public keys, right? So, and guess what? FIDO authentication in the end is proven to prove control of the public keys, right, or DPAs. The DID authentication allows the individual to prove the subject of the verifiable credential, and then the DID authentication may be used for the authentication at the reliant parties. And one of the very smart engineering approaches was like, oh, we will use DID authentication for everything because this is the new way of doing things. Let's forget about everything else, right? And that actually worked quite well and nicely in some scenarios, except that it went in conflict with a number of the existing implementations, and obviously implementing a new technology such as SSI by making sure that everybody revolutionizes their current authentication approach is not the easiest way to go forward. So we started thinking how DID authentication and FIDO authentication can kind of work together and collaborate. When we started doing that, right, one of the interesting things was to look at exactly where DID authentication is used, right? So what we talked about when I showed the diagram when for the credential issuance and verification flow, that the DID authentication is used for issuers, the DID authentication is used for the verifiers. DID authentication used to verify for verifiers not only to prove that the presenter is in control of the same DID, right? But also to reestablish a session based on the trusted DID ID. And we also found that DID authentication is available in the draft forms in various current protocols, right? So we're kind of looking at the DID authentication being available either through the VC API, or we're looking at the DID authentication available through the OpenID Connect protocol, or we're looking at DID authentication available through the DIDCOM. And in the SSI world, these are, I wouldn't call them religious camps that actually believe that one way is better than another one, but there are lots of very convinced people that think about what is the best way to do this, right? And obviously, when we're looking at it from the large perspective, we're trying to balance the needs of where the technology is right now, what is the best way to do it in the most privacy-preserving way, and what is actually the best way to integrate with various issuers and the reliant parties or verifiers, so it doesn't break anybody's enterprise platform, right? So that's a very interesting balance there. I represent the company called Avast. We are very big, I guess, internet security platform. We, as you might know, Avast has merged with Norton recently. So like we represent that area of consumer security space. And we have recently rejoined FIDO, because before that we were members of FIDO when I was working for the smaller company acquired by Avast. And we have rejoined FIDO with the goal of ensure that we should not have two things. And how we're going to achieve that, that's probably a topic for the plenary discussions. And it's very, very important. But we want to ensure that we basically find a way so that FIDO devices can be used in the DDoS scenario, right? Like that's where we are. And we want to ensure that we can do the authentication to the credential providers. And we want to ensure that we can have authentication to the wallet, and we have authentication to the cloud, and that we do not mix these things together in a way that we have large implementations going their independent ways. It's very encouraging that actually on various groups in DIF, in OEDC, right, are thinking about that. There is a way, for example, how to do it in a self-issued OpenID provider, and how to associate DID authentication with that. We personally, like we as a company, we have experience in that. We as a company have experience in DIDCOM quite a bit. The VC API actually seems to be very, very promising. But in order for SSI to grow and be user-friendly, I'm pretty sure that we need to ensure to be compliant. Well, compliant maybe not the best word, right? That we will have to ensure that SSI implementations will heavily rely on FIDO, right, and passkeys, and for user authentication at various points. So that's very, very clear. And we're also thinking how we may integrate the FIDO flows with various SSI flows where we can actually add identity to the FIDO flows. Might be interesting, right? Especially if identity will be available and provided through verifiable credentials. And that seems to be a leading way, at least on the identity side. And there are a lot of potential synergies between the FIDO and SSI protocols, right? And it is well recognized by the community that is looking into these protocols. We're looking for the OpenID Foundation leadership in this area, quite honestly. And these are the challenges, basically, that we have to resolve. Hopefully, we will talk a little bit more about this at this plenary and at the plenary that will be coming next year in the working groups. And on that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmitry. I have a question that's come in online. The authentication registry often takes the form of a public or private blockchain, but every solution seems to be using their own preference. How can the verifier accept the customer's registry of choice without implementing all of them?
That's a fantastic question, all right? And to answer the question fully, we would probably want to have a 3 or 4 hour forum because there are so many options and so many ideas, right? But maybe my personal point of view is that we will end up with deed verification scenarios that do not require deeds to be registered on a blockchain per se, right, on a specific blockchain. There are implementations like that in the open source community already. And that because of ability not to root deeds on the blockchain, we will be able to find a much greater interoperability between the deed registries. That's probably, I will conclude at that.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the room?
I saw two.
Yeah.
It's hard to see. It's like these lights actually are very blinding.
Thank you for the talk. I was curious about the example you provided. Are those proof of concept or are those mass production deployment?
So IATA is mass production, and the permanent residence card, it's a Department of Homeland Security SVIP POC.
In your early example, you brought up a bank as an easy story to tell, and then you said that that was a bad one to bring up.
Yeah.
What's the catch, and how does this relate or not relate to the financial sector?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will actually. So we have, and now I have to take a comment saying that I will actually talk about what I know is implemented, right? Because like I'm from the company called SecureKey. And we actually have implemented a fairly interesting use cases in Canada where banks are relying to open a bank account on verifiable credentials that they get, right? So that's why it's an easy example. But where it becomes a little bit more complicated, how we link the authentication associated with that third-party, basically, identity proofing event with the bank authentication. Because in my experience, the banks that I have worked with, they typically like to have a full control of the authentication without outsourcing it to other parties or without actually registering the link of identity proofing, which is the KYC AML process, to the authentication on their site. Right, and that's why that was the case. It's easy example from the usability perspective, but it's hard example from the real implementation perspective because there is so much governance and compliance issues are associated with the link between identity between account opening and consequential user authentication to that account. In my experience. Please, of course.
Would you go so far as to say that it would? Sorry. For a follow-up, would you go so far as to say that it would be a good solution if it wasn't for the
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I would say it would be a fantastic solution from the user perspective, because if I open an account and prove my identity with whatever agent I have in my hand or in my control, and it's actually trusted enough to open an account, I should be ideally able to use the authentication credentials associated with that agent to authenticate further into that account, right? But once again, just from the practicality of that implementation, I'd rather not to use bank. I'd rather use some less regulated party.
Thank you.
All right, I think we're about out of time, so thank you, Dmitry.
Thank you.
And in just a couple of minutes, we will have our next presenters.